Welcome everyone to this series of talks dedicated to bridging the gap between graph theory and the robotics community. My name is Julio. I am from the University of Zaragoza in the north part of Spain, and I'm truly honored to share the research we conducted on exploiting graph theory for efficient decision-making in ActiveSLAM. Before starting, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers for granting me the chance to speak at this workshop. I regret that I'm unable to deliver this talk in person, but I'm still grateful for the opportunity to address you remotely. In this talk, I discuss the work I've done during part of my PhD about applying graph theory to ActiveSLAM. I will start by briefly introducing this decision-making problem and providing an overview in graph theory. Then, I will present the theoretical contributions we made relating the feature information matrix commonly used to make decisions in ActiveSLAM and the Lablation matrix of the underlying postgraph. In the final part of this talk, I will present three cases that exemplify the practical implications of our theoretical contributions. So first things first, what is ActiveSLAM? ActiveSLAM addresses the problem of determining the optimal movement of a robot which is reconstructing an unknown environment in order to create the most accurate and complete model of it. In other words, it's trying to constantly improve its localization and the map representation estimates. Many approaches have been developed to approximately solve this problem, being the three-stage split a widely adopted pipeline. It divides ActiveSLAM into three key steps. First, we need to identify a set of candidate locations the robot could move to. Then, we need to compute the utility of visiting each of them. And finally, it all comes down to selecting and executing the actions that would take the robot from its current position to the optimal goal location. As we can imagine, the second stage plays a crucial role and is also the most complex and computationally intensive. This stage heavily relies on analyzing the future expected states and their covariance or information matrices. Within this field, it is active Graph-SLAM which is of particular interest for this talk. In this instantiation of the problem, the state is represented by a graph, and therefore each candidate goal will result in a different posterior graph configuration. In this toy example, we can see how each candidate destination would yield different graph, and therefore a different feature information matrix. Comparing these matrices is a common approach to select the optimal destination. For example, using theory of optimal experimental design and the so-called Optimality Criteria. These optimality criteria define a set of mappings from the matrix to the scalar space. They are functionals of the eigenvalues of the feature information matrix and serve to easily compare a set of destinations and to select the optimal one. Among the set of optimality criteria, T and D optimality are probably the most known, corresponding to computing the trace and the determinant of the matrix. While these criteria offer very strong mathematical foundations and will indeed reveal the optimal choice, they are computationally intensive and usually result in the robot taking several seconds and even minutes to make one single decision. This issue has traditionally represented a major problem for online robotic exploration, making the community to shift towards other faster approaches such as heuristic methods or information theoretic metrics. I can imagine that you've already had some preliminaries on graph theory during this workshop, but I wanted to briefly comment on the most fundamental element that mathematically describes a graph, the Lablation matrix. It can be computed, as we can see in this toy example, as the sum of the contributions of each edge in the graph. Therefore, each of the constraints in Graph-SLAM acts as a generator of the graph Lablation. The graph Lablation will fully describe the structure or topology of the postgraph. The analysis of the eigenvalues of this matrix has long been studied in the graph theory field to analyze the connections of the graph, their weakest parts, and so on. In general, these functionals of the eigenvalues implicitly measure the number of connections in the graph and also their importance. However, if we weight each of the edges of the graph, it can also shed some light on the quality of those connections. Now that we have established the foundations of active SLAM, let's explore how graph theory can be leveraged to enhance the decision-making process. The feature information matrix can be expressed as the sum of the information contributions of each edge, and leveraging the properties of the Kronecker product, we can relate it to the generators of the graph Lablation that I previously mentioned. As we can see in this toy example, the block sparsity pattern of the graph Lablation will convey that of the feature information matrix. We can further develop this relationship to link the information and the Laplacian matrix directly in two cases. First, when the uncertainty is the same for all constraints, or in other words, when all edges share the same relative information matrix in the graph, we can move this term outside the sum and therefore relate Y and L matrices. On the other hand, if the uncertainty is not constant, we can always consider it to be naively bounded by a diagonal matrix populated with the highest eigenvalue of the relative information matrix. In this case, we will need to use the weighted Lablation instead, and Y will be bounded by L. Therefore, we will need to weight each of the edges in the graph with the maximum eigenvalue of its associated information matrix, and then compute the weighted Lablation matrix of the entire graph. For active post-graph SLAM, in which the map points are marginalized and only robot poses are represented as nodes, this idea will allow us to reason over the weighted Lablation instead of doing so over the high-dimensional feature information matrix. To do so, we need to transfer the relationship between the Laplacian and the information matrix to the spectral domain. For the constant uncertainty case, there will be a proportional relationship between optimality criteria of the information matrix and optimality criteria of the graph Lablation, which can be expressed in terms of the well-known connectivity indices, such as the average node degree, D, or the number of spanning trees, T. The inequality for the bounded case will also transfer to the eigenvalue domain, but more interestingly, an approximation relationship will exist when the same criterion to be evaluated is used to weight each of the edges. For example, the optimality of the information matrix will be approximately equal to evaluating the optimality of the Laplacian of the underlying postgraph, in which edges are weighted with the optimality of the relative information matrices. For the case of constant uncertainty, we can see that computing optimality criteria with both methods yield the same results. In the right image, we can see the significant difference in computing time of both methods, being about 10 times lower at the end of the sequence of the FRH dataset. We've also tested the case of variable uncertainty in which the approximation relationships hold. We evaluated several datasets, obtaining approximation errors below 3%. More interestingly, the trend of optimality criteria was always maintained over time, and computations required only 10% of the time the traditional method would. We decided to bring this closer to reality by implementing a comprehensive active SLAM system that builds upon the previous theoretical results. To achieve this, we adopted a three-stage approach in which a set of candidate goals is identified, and then optimality criteria is used to select the most beneficial one. One crucial step in this method is estimating the future expected states, which in this case translates into computing the posterior post graphs over which to compute the spectral graph metrics. The two figures displayed in the right part of the slide illustrate this concept. In the upper figure, we can observe the posterior graph, depicted in green, after visiting the candidate frontier F1, while the lower figure shows the post graph after visiting F2. Notice the differences between the connections in both graphs and how that translates into the posterior information matrices, and equivalently in the graph Lablations. In order to evaluate the effectiveness of our approach, we conducted an active SLAM experiment for 30 minutes, comparing our approach to other traditional and state-of-the-art methods. The results we obtained shed light on the advantages of our approach. The maps generated after the experiment are displayed in the first row of the image, while the second row are circular representations of the post graphs. Therefore, inner connections in these graphs will represent look-closer constraints. As we can see, the maps generated by the first three agents, which represent very fast heuristic methods, are extensive in coverage. However, they suffer from higher localization errors and a noticeable lack of inner connections in their post graphs. The next two columns represent state-of-the-art methods that rely on computing the optimality over the information matrix. These algorithms indeed lead to optimal decisions, but the decision-making time they require is excessive, which makes the robot to spend several seconds to make the next move. This results in exploring only a small portion of the environment. Finally, our method strikes a balance between the two groups of methods. Decision-making using the graph Lablation is extremely fast, thus being able to cover a reasonable portion of the environment, and the decisions are made based on a strong mathematical foundation, and therefore optimal. We can also analyze the evolution of the optimality over time in the experiments. Traditional methods are indeed optimal at the cost of lower exploration efficiency, as they prioritize spending a large amount of time to select the best decision rather than covering a larger area. On the other hand, heuristic methods excel in exploration efficiency, although decisions are not usually the optimal ones. Our method, represented here in red, maintains a reasonable level of optimality while achieving an effective coverage of the environment. This unique combination of efficiency and optimality sets our approach apart and positions it as a promising solution in active SLAM. It is worth noting that in all cases, using the graph Lablation led to the exact same decisions that analyzing the full information matrix. Given the extraordinary results obtained in the previous framework, we decided to extend it using a state-of-the-art visual SLAM algorithm. Explorable SLAM is also a three-stage active SLAM system where candidate frontiers are identified. A decision-making module leverages the underlying graph structure to select the optimal one, and a navigation module deals with moving the robot to that location. Since we are using OrbSLAM as backbone, we take the full hashing from the optimization, marginalize the map points, and prune the sparse-most connections. By doing this, we obtain a prune information matrix that conveys the sparsity pattern of the essential postgraph in OrbSLAM. Then we hallucinate this postgraph to its frontier and generate a set of posterior postgraphs to compare. In this process, we also consider the appearance of loop closure constraints. Each edge in the graph is weighted by the optimality of the relative information matrix, or Hessian. And for those edges hallucinated, we predict an information matrix that accounts for both exploration and exploitation. In this video, we can see a robot exploring a simulation environment in gazebo. Despite the size of the postgraph, the number of reobservation edges, and the number of candidate destinations, the decision-making process is extremely fast. Here, the Gridmap is only used for frontier detection and visualization, and we can see the small amount of time the robot needs to hallucinate the postgraph to every candidate and select the optimal one. The third application we developed that exploits the graph spectrum is a novel stopping criterion. The question of when to stop performing such an intensive task as ActiveSLAM is crucial, although it has been overlooked in the literature given the current developing status of most approaches. Although using the fast methods I just presented makes decision-making less intensive, the question of when an unknown environment has been completely explored, or when the current exploration strategy is not adding any information to the SLAM system, is still an exciting field of research. The use of optimality criteria evolution to assess task completion has been identified as a promising research direction for ActiveSLAM before, but it's been intractable with traditional formulations of, for example, the optimality. By using the advantageous relationship that I discussed before, we are capable of computing the optimality after each decision the robot makes without a significant overhead. Therefore, we can measure the task improvement over time and identify task completion. We conducted several autonomous exploration experiments to compare the stopping criteria widely used in ActiveSLAM works and this criterion, which monitors the evolution of the graph's optimality. We showed that no prior knowledge is required to identify task completion, in contrast to temporal or coverage-based criteria. In this example, we can see the maps and post graph generated at the moment the algorithm autonomously decided that the task was complete. In the first case, the temporal criterion was just triggered after 10 minutes. We can easily see that some parts of the environment were not correctly explored. On the other hand, our algorithm only identified task completion when the information returns were extremely low, therefore creating a much more complete and accurate model of the environment. We have another example in this slide. In this case, however, the time assigned to explore the environment was excessive, and a coverage-based criterion also left many parts of the environment unexplored. These two examples have shown that optimality criteria is an excellent tool for assessing task completion, and that their use in online systems is feasible if we exploit the structure of the underlying postgraphs. I would like to conclude this talk by highlighting some key points and also promising directions that intersect the fields of graph theory and robotic exploration. By combining these fields, we will uncover valuable insights. Based on related work in the field of graph theory and SLAM, we have identified a very strong and general connection between the feature information matrix in GraphSLAM and the Lablation of the underlying graph. We have found that by exploiting this relationship, modern optimality criteria can be computed in a fraction of the time, making their use in online ActiveSLAM algorithms possible. The optimal decision-making, once overlooked due to its high computational cost, is now feasible in real time, opening up a whole new range of opportunities in the field, such as task completion identification or lightweight communication in multi-robot setups. Transferring these relationships to other domains, such as information theoretic metrics, or to different graph structures, such as full SLAM graphs or even scene graphs, are exciting avenues that will certainly see progress in the short term. Finally, the reason over the graph topology of our spectrum shifts the traditional paradigm in ActiveSLAM to graph prediction beyond line of sight, a new problem that can leverage existing learning-based models. I wanted to thank you all for your attention, and now I'd like to take any live questions you might have.
Okay, yeah, any questions from the audience for Julio? Okay. Okay, well, while some folks are thinking, I have one for you, Julio. So first off, thanks for the very nice talk. And actually, I had a question about one of the things that you sort of alluded to at the end, which was the possibility of, so if I understand correctly, the current, most of the work that you described here was based on a frontier exploration type strategy. But you kind of mentioned, I think at the end, the possibility of using beyond line of sight prediction to move into frontier areas. And I was curious if you could say a little bit more about what that might look like, or if you've thought about, if you guys have looked at that problem yourselves yet, or how, if you have any thoughts on what such a system might look like or how it might be approached.
Yes, great question. I guess you can hear me right. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. So that's an interesting question because usually in Active SLAM, the main problem was to predict or to estimate the future states. And now that problem can be shifted to just predicting the post graph, since we can just reason over it. So we have not done any work on this matter, but exploiting graph neural networks to predict or to hallucinate the graphs towards the identified frontiers is a very interesting area. There is still some work on graph neural networks that aim to predict graphs in SLAM. So merging these advances with in the active SLAM field would be great.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it seems like a super interesting direction for future research, and potentially kind of a nice connection between the stuff that you presented and the earlier talk from Luana. Okay, any other questions from the audience for Julio? Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for the very nice talk, Julio. That was great.